Good afternoon. I'm going to give a short talk about the mapping used as the starting point for the application of urban planning and building regulations in Australia using the case of Victoria, a state of Australia, as an example. So what you can see here is Melbourne University's logo there. I work at Melbourne University, and primarily I work in urban design, urban planning, related to many disasters, but in particular wildfire. We call it bushfire in Australia, or wildfire sometimes. If I sometimes lapse into bushfire, I mean wildfire, so please bear with me. And we seem to, there we go. This image is of Bendigo, a regional town in Victoria, Australia, that suffered a pretty significant fire in 2009. There were many other fires in Victoria during those few days. And one of the characteristics of this fire is that it penetrated into the very edge of the urban fabric through vegetation corridors. And it was a real wake-up call for thinking about the nature of the interface, the structures there, the density of them, and how we can manage wildfire risk better in those locations. So the system we have now in Victoria, and it's essentially the same across Australia, but we have state-based legislation. I'm just going to describe Victoria because it's essentially the example we could apply across the rest of Australia. The starting point for the way we apply these planning and building regulations is mapping, and that mapping categorises the level of risk into no or very low risk, medium risk, or high to extreme risk. So this is just the starting point, and it invokes what we would call a trigger that particular provisions or regulations would subsequently be applied through the building system. We have the National Construction Code of Australia, which covers pretty much all structures. They need a building permit. And if there's a higher risk, on top of the building code, we also have urban planning provisions, urban planning regulations. So just describing this in a diagrammatic form, you can see as risk, potential risk is seen to go from none to medium, or low to medium to high to extreme. We go from no controls to building controls alone to building code controls and urban planning controls. So if you imagine this just in terms of, I guess you could call this set theory, we've got the whole state of Victoria. Some of it doesn't have a bushfire or wildfire risk, so that's not covered by any provisions. A lot of our state is subject to low, medium, or right up to extreme, and that is covered by the bushfire prone areas provisions, the building provisions. And then as part of that large area, some of it has the potential for high to extreme risk, and that is mapped, as I'll show you. So those areas that are bushfire prone fall into that low to medium category, have building provisions, and the height of extreme risk in the mapping has the bushfire management overlay through the planning scheme applied as well. So you can see if we look at the map of Victoria, Australia, you'll see that darker green, maybe khaki showing on your screen. A lot of the state is included within the bushfire prone area mapping. So that triggers a building code response. So just for an example, say this is in the Yarra Ranges on the edge of Melbourne. Melbourne has a very large edge and it's quite low density and varies considerably in its interactions with vegetated areas. This area happens to edge onto reasonably mountainous and well-vegetated areas, large areas of vegetation. We've got farmland here and grasslands, and then get into fairly typical urban densities here of around 12 to 15 dwellings per hectare. So then you can see here in the sandy tan kind of colour, this is the bushfire prone area mapping. And these are areas that have some risk of some form from wildfire, could be low to medium, right up to high and extreme, and that's included. And you can see basically it's anywhere that's near some form of vegetation. That includes these creeks that run through the urban form and remnant vegetation. Maybe it could be parks and gardens that have been set aside in between these urban areas and then next to farmlands and indeed next to these mountainous areas. So that's just building controls. It all gets covered by it if there's some risk of wildfire. But then I've laid over that the bushfire management overlay where there's potential for high to extreme risks. And you can see where it covers areas that have more vegetation, heavier vegetation, and slopes and extensive areas of vegetation where the fire could build its intensity. So these areas are not included. They're grasslands, they're relatively flat. So where we have some risk, but it's not as extreme potentially as these more hilly areas with heavier vegetation on them. And if we zoom in a little bit on one of those, you can start to see, I've tried to have a transparency in the layers there. You can start to see where there's less slope and further from vegetation, it's not included. Then as we get up to the edge, it's in the bushfire prone areas, that medium to low risk. And then we get onto the real slopes with vegetation and it's in the bushfire management overlay because we can have extreme risks. So, there are two primary controls that stem from that mapping that are triggered. If it's in bushfire prone areas, this Australian standard, which is essentially just about the structure that is built, there's a standard set for construction of buildings in bushfire prone areas. That under the Act, the Building Act, is required to be applied if that mapping shows it might be subject to some wildfire risk. When it's a more extreme risk, high to extreme, we also have the planning scheme controls that go on top of the building controls as well. Again, that's undertaken through the mapping. This is another version of the map I just showed you. And that mapping then triggers the application of these planning controls that set a higher standard of risk reduction for any new structures and indeed the arrangements of buildings, roads and water points, etc. on that land. So that brings me to a close just for this brief snapshot of the mapping. In subsequent videos, I'll also talk about the detail of the building code, how that's assessed and applied. And in another video, I'll also talk about the planning controls through the bushfire management overlay that apply to high to extreme risk sites as well. Thank you very much.